Welcome to this edition of Workplace Culture Wisdom, a conversation series with experienced leaders. Welcome to another edition of our Workplace Wisdom series, where we talk with people that have leadership roles often in addressing issues related to workplace culture. And today we're fortunate to have Elise Chambers with us. Elise is, hi, Elise.
Hi.
Elise is a highly skilled mediator and attorney and often finds herself working on issues related to workplace culture. And so we're looking forward to our conversations this morning. And Elise,
Super excited to be here.
Great. That's just delightful. And Elise, I'd like to start the conversation by thinking about the role of policies and structures in organizations, whether they're for-profit or not-profit or government, and the importance of them in helping sustain a healthy workplace culture.
Yeah, I think there are policies that exist on paper that nobody can find or ever thinks about or ever talks about or remembers exist. And then there are policies that exist nowhere except in the behaviors and actions of everyone. And then there's everything in between. And I think the two pieces that I think about when I think about what are the policies are, do the policies work? Like, are they alive? Are they functional? Do people know where to find them? Does everyone follow them? Does everyone understand them? And then are they hidden or unknown or implicit? And then are they dead? Are they just pieces of paper that sit somewhere or a file that no one can ever find? And that really, to me, says a lot about how people probably feel about the culture in their workplace.
And one of the things that we know from behavioral science is when there are gaps in information, people will fill in those gaps with their own information, whether it's incorrect or not, because people like to be informed, they like stability, and they like familiarity. And so they'll fill in those gaps with what's familiar to them.
Yeah, I think that is so fascinating too. All it takes is one person filling a gap to create an ad hoc policy that can live on its own outside of anyone's intentions to have it be created or to exist. And then it gets passed on to everyone new who joins an organization, and suddenly everyone's doing the same thing. And it may not be anything even close to what leadership intentionally created or put out there.
In a slightly different direction, if an organization has some issues, they may be in trouble, they might just have some internal conflict as a result of workplace culture issues or communications, what advice do you have to help resolve the situations or help organizations that find themselves in some workplace culture challenges or difficulties to help them move forward?
The thing that organizations always want to do, that is the worst thing in my mind that you can do, is our leadership's going to get together, we're going to make a policy, and we're just going to hand it out to everyone on a piece of paper and by email. Here you go. Here's the policy. Everybody do this and stop doing whatever it is you were doing. I think that's the worst possible, because you end up with something that is either overly strict, overly complicated, doesn't address the actual needs or concerns, and that then feels punitive and permissive in the wrong measures in the wrong places. It's always going to be a bad fit. And I think the better course of action is to get people in small enough groups that they feel comfortable being honest to say, what do you think the current policy is? What do you think the rules are? Like, as you understand them, what are the rules? Where do you see those rules working and not working? And then to compile all of that information and figure out, where do you actually have understanding of what's expected and where are you missing that entirely? And then you can craft something that actually makes sense. And then when you're trying to implement it, you can say, hey, we asked you what you wanted, and this is what you said you needed, and so here's what we made. And then you have to go the extra step and say, what do you think about this? What do you think about the way we put this together? Tell us what you really think. Is this going to work? And that's where you get buy-in. And if you don't take that iterative step, I think you end up with people who find ways to work around it. You find people who are, right, like, they're not going to do what you want them to do unless you ask them what works for you.
And what often are some of the sources that for when organizations get in trouble? Does it start
Mm.
regularly at the top, at the leadership, or what are some of when you want to get called in to mediate a situation, for example?
Yeah, workplace situations, anytime I get called, my first question is, and when did you get a new supervisor?
Uh,
And is that the same time the conflict started? So, which to me, and it can be on that micro level, like individual employee or two and an individual supervisor, or it can be on a macro level. And you say, when did you get new leadership? When did you get someone new in leadership? When did you get a new operations director? When did you get a new fill in the blank? Because it's almost always a new something, someone that upsets the apple cart, that upsets the status quo. And that's where you see conflict. And it's not that the status quo was good, it's that it was familiar and comfortable, and everybody knew how to behave under, like everybody knew what to do.
right.
And so there was that familiarity that you talked about. Like everybody just understood what was expected. And then someone new comes along and applies the rules differently, or actually reads the policy that nobody has read for 20 years and does stuff differently. And that's when we see that break in communication, that breakdown in trust, and conflict emerges.
Several years ago, I was asked to come into a situation in a staff team in an organization, actually a labor union, and there was enormous conflict amongst the staff team, all directed at one person, and it centered around time cards, and her responsibility was to keep track of time cards, and she took that very seriously. The the head of the team had told people, well, if you work at night, you can come in late the next day. And so then their time card would say arrive at 10, leave at 5 instead of arrive at 8, leave at 5 or whatever. And and so we shifted the conversation to about worldviews. And she was doing what she was told to do, and her worldview was to do it correctly. And then other people were given a completely different message from from the same supervisor. And so once we depersonalized it, then there was an ability to find a solution. And I'm wondering, if that, when you're in to help mediate a situation, how important that kind of is to not make it, to depersonalize the situation and make it about whether it's the policy or the rule or lack of communication or whatever the circumstance might be.
That no, that's a great to think about. I talk specifically with folks about the interpersonal conflict and then kind of the structural conflict. So we pull it apart, but it's interesting that you say depersonalize so that they can see kind of like these are just the pieces. I tend to personalize it very
Yeah.
intentionally at the beginning because I want people to build enough of an understanding of each other's perspectives that they're willing to start to open up their own perspective to maybe my truth isn't the only truth. Maybe my truth is part of a bigger truth. Maybe I have a puzzle piece, not the whole picture. So sometimes I will very intentionally personalize, like, how long have you known each other? When did it work well together? What do you work well on? And sometimes it backfires. Sometimes people are like, I hate them. I couldn't possibly. I have absolutely had those cases where the best answer was, and we're going to move you each to a different team. Nobody's going to stay. It's like a divorce. Nobody's staying on this team. Everybody's moving out and getting a different team. And that was the best that they could do. But sometimes intentionally personalizing it gets rid of the vitriol, gets rid of the like, oh, that's right. You're a person, you're a coworker. There are things I really like about you. There are things we connect on. There are things we both really believe in.
Yeah, that makes good sense. And I know in this situation, we tried to make it about the perspective and not about the individual, which sounds similar to what you're saying. Is how are you seeing this situation? How can we understand how you see this situation?
That it reminds me of it's the your five identities at work. You have your role, your status, autonomy, right? That there are all these pieces that go into it. And so when you think about role and how do you pull the person and the role apart and say this role is to follow these rules. We've had that in organizations where you've got someone who's in charge of like the clerical piece, right? The filing, the whatever, the database management, and everybody wants to get mad at IT. Everybody's mad at the IT person. Right?
Right.
The reality is the role of IT sometimes is just hard. It's just hard to do the pieces of that job And you could have a very lovely person that everyone gets along with in the lunchroom, but then they go back to their IT role and everyone hates what they have to say. But sometimes that's just the limitations of the structural pieces of that role. And so pulling apart the person from the role sometimes can
Yeah.
be really beneficial.
And along those lines, as you've been to some of our art of hosting things, and you know that one of the things we talk about is role theory, and
Yeah.
the notion that if we just got rid of Elise, all of our problems would be solved, because Elise always says no to everything. When in fact, someone else then assumes the role of being the person that says no. And
Yes.
so again, recognizing the roles what role is existing in this team, this organization, that's really at the heart of what's going on here, not the person, the role.
That, and I think that also pulls at the threads that come with when you have leadership making decisions, but saying things like, "Oh, we value your feedback," but then they don't ever use your feedback. And like in those cases, right? Like the role of leadership is to say no sometimes.
Right.
And maybe you don't like that, but as long as leadership is genuine and authentic about the boundaries can't shift and move. They have to be solid. That's the whole point of a boundary. And you have to be authentic about, like, yeah, I don't like that either. Or actually, I do think this is a good rule, but here's why.
Right. It's the actions speak louder than words kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. And your actions and words have to line up, or people won't trust you and they won't trust the role that you're in and the reasons that you're doing what you're doing. And then those no's get really hard. And then people work around them and they get in trouble.
And when an organization comes to you and recognizing they've got some issues, or sometimes you get called in and you're helping them sort of turn the situation around, to minimize or eliminate the conflict or rebuild that trust that you were just talking about. What are some key factors that are very helpful in helping organizations reestablish or strengthen their healthy workplace culture?
Yeah, I think because I come from a mediator's lens of always looking for, where is the conflict? How did it start? When did it start? What are the pieces that are causing it? I think one of the things that I always try to help them map out is what is not working, right? It's very art of hosting. What's not working? What is working? The other thing, as a mediator, I press and I press. And then when I feel that I've pressed like just whoop, I'm on the edge of pressing too far, I have to back off and I have to have someplace else to go. So in negotiation theory, we always talk about substantive moves and process moves, right? So you get stuck on the substance. Oh, we're stuck on the dollars. We're stuck on the terms. We're stuck on the rules. Okay, let's make some process moves. When do we want to start tomorrow? What do we want to have for a lunch break tomorrow? You get those process pieces. How are we going to convene next time? Who's going to be there next time? Always having those, you need multiple places to jump to and from, because I think there's a lot of progress that gets made when their brains and their bodies are allowed to relax from the hot issue and go look at something else, and to be able to pull them off the hot thing, to get really, really, really close. There it is. There's the hot thing. Pull them off, give them something that's cool to work with instead until maybe that heats up. And then you come back over here and then and it keeps our brains engaged. It keeps us from getting too over the line and kind of past the point of logic and ability to think and reason and be creative. And so I'm always tracking multiple pieces of the conversation, move you to this, move you to this. And it also gives me information in terms of, like, where is the deep, hard, hot stuff? And where is it easy, right? And then you also have pieces and levers to move. Let's get these 3 easier things done. We can save this big one for later, or let's dive in on the big one. And then we know these are going to be easy later.
It feels a bit like thinking about the iceberg in a way. And so we've got where we talk about feedback loops, in the area that's above the water line. But then people know that they've got some issue that's a conflict. So they sort of move the deck chairs around, give stage titles or that kind of thing. And really, the deep stuff that you're talking about often is avoided, as much as possible.
And I think that the example I give when I train new mediators, when we talk about interests and positions, right? The positions are always the surface stuff, and then those interests are kind of the good. And then, so I talk about avocados. I don't know if you have a garden or you compost, but avocados are the bane of my existence. Right? Right. So you've got the skin of the avocado, which is like the hard and you can't use it. You stick that in your compost, and 3 years later, your compost poops it back out. Like it's still the skin, it doesn't ever go away. You can't do anything with the skin of the avocado. You can bury it in your garden and it's still there. So I talk about the skin of the avocado. Those are our positions. It's the armor that we have built up around ourselves in a conflict. Like, this is what I need and want and what's not working and why I can't do my job and why this person is the worst. It's our armor, and it doesn't ever go anywhere. But it doesn't have to. You just have to get under it. And then you get the meat of the avocado. You get the good stuff, the interests. Those are the things, like, everybody here agrees we need to be able to do our jobs. Everybody agrees we need to have these, in place. And we forget about the seed. Because I don't know if you throw those in your compost, but I do. And again, 3 years later, that stuff is still sitting in my yard. But it's a seed. Avocados aren't vegetables, they're fruits. It's a seed. That core, those are our human needs, and they don't ever go away. Our human needs are universal, and they are actually the beginning of the future. And if you can get to the place where you can talk about the stuff that everyone assumes is too hard to get to, too gnarly, it's not actually. If I can get through that layer of interest where people are logical and creative and can problem solve, and if I can get to the seed and say things like, hey, you 3 people have been here since this organization was founded. You built this. You remember what it was like to work here when you didn't have an office with lights on, when you were reusing pieces of paper out of the recycling bin because you couldn't afford paper. And you 4 people have come on since then. And the reality is, you all came to this because you love this work, because there's no place else that's doing this work, because you care about, you get to those needs. As a human, we all need to feel like the work we do every day matters in some way, shape, or form. We need to feel like we are good at what we do. And then when you can get people to acknowledge, oh, we all, like, that is the seed that builds the future. But it's so hard for people to want to touch it. Nobody wants to touch the grimy avocado pits out in the yard. But if you crack them open, that's where the future comes from.
Right. Lovely. Love that analogy. That's fantastic. So one last kind of question. And it centers around how to think about the workplace and human rights. And I think about it in, like, one of our little 60-second spotlight on the workplace talks about the worst thing to happen at work is to be ignored, to not be acknowledged, or not feeling psychologically safe, those kinds of things. And so, when we think about, we can think about human rights in this giant global kind of sense, of, the right to live and food and clean air and water and other things. But how do you think about that in terms of the workplace?
I think it becomes incredibly complex. If we think about, legally speaking, there are anti-discrimination laws. There's the ADA, there's the Minnesota Human Rights Act, there's HUD has a bunch of statutes, right? There are laws that say you aren't allowed to discriminate, EEOC. And I think the problem with that is it's the floor. It's the bare minimum of what people should get at work. It's the bare minimum of what employers are expected to do. And that, I think, is really difficult, because when you have discrimination in a workplace, when you have disparate treatment, you have people for whom the standard is way up here and people who are fighting to get the floor to apply to them. And that difference is heartbreaking and shattering. And it will absolutely kill a workplace culture. It will absolutely kill it. You won't have retention. You will have people acting out. You will have incredibly deep interpersonal conflict for so many reasons. You will have people doing things that are so borderline egregious, but not quite stepping up, right? Because they're looking at that floor and they're like, the policy says I can do anything that's not below this line. It is so damaging, so damaging. And you can look at any study that talks about the time people spend away from work, the amount of sick days and sick hours people take when they don't feel psychologically safe at work, when they feel like they are being discriminated against at work, when they feel like their boss isn't giving them the promotions, when they feel like their boss isn't giving them the good jobs. the time that people take, the productivity suck on a corporation is huge. I mean, you can't overstate what a cost that is to an organization to have people taking sick time because they don't feel safe or appreciated at work.
That's such a key and critical point, and something we've really tried to emphasize also in our work on healthy. The costs of not having a healthy workplace culture are significant,
Oh,
and and how do you look at an organization and quantify that for them?
and I think that it's that investment from leadership, that leadership has to be invested enough to understand. I can tell you how much it costs to have someone come in and mediate case by case by case, right? Like you call in a mediator to figure out interpersonal, inter team conflicts. You can do that 2 dozen times. Or for that cost, you could fix your workplace culture. And then you don't need a mediator. You don't
Right?
need any of that.
Yeah. It's like the cost of if your retention is really poor, the cost of training a new employee is significant. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, and it's the training cost, the cost and those hidden costs that go with it. Then there's the cost on the morale, right? So you have
Yeah.
high turnover, you're constantly training, the workload of the folks who are competent and can do the job because they've been trained goes up, their morale goes down. They see their coworkers leaving, their morale drops again. Now your productivity has dropped even more than it would have like the high turnover isn't just about the people who are competent to do the work. It's about how slow the productivity gets with the folks who are competent to do the work because morale has dipped so low.
Great point. Thanks. Well, Elise, thank you so much for today. And I'm wondering if you have any sort of final thoughts or comments you'd like to share with us before we end our conversation.
I what I say to everyone, don't be afraid of conflict. Conflict isn't the problem. Conflict is just an indication that there's work to be done. And if you can start to see conflict as simply the messenger and not get mad at it, but take the message from it and see what you can do to make things better, it takes a lot of pressure off and it can actually resolve things at a really low level.
Fantastic. Thanks so much. That's just such an important point. And thanks again for your time today, Elise. This is fantastic.
Thank you so much. It was great to see you.
Go to worldviewprograms.com to learn more about our healthy workplace culture program options.